Hello, Professor Monroe here again, and in this video we will complete the critical thinking module by applying the critical thinking model from your textbook. This is sort of the culmination of all the critical thinking skills that you've been developing so far, and this model will constitute the backbone of one of the major assignments that you'll have for this course. So understanding how to move through this process is of vital importance for your success in this class. There are two things to know going into this discussion as we look at this model today. The first is that your instructor may have different specific instructions for how they want you to approach this set of steps. That's perfectly okay. What we're doing today is just a matter of making you familiar with how this process might work. Your instructor may ask more or less of you depending on their own particular needs. Secondly, this application depends on your having read Karina's dilemma from the chapter on consequentialist ethical theories. You want to be certain that you're familiar with that case study before we look at this model. That way you'll understand what's going on as we move through the steps. In fact, it may not be a bad idea to have that case study with you as we talk through each of these phases. So if you need to, take a moment, get the case study from your textbook, and then reconvene with us here for the video, and then we'll go through these steps one by one to help you have a fuller understanding of how critical thinking can help you solve an ethical problem. So, the first step of our process is identification, as you may recall from an earlier video. The first step in solving a problem, obviously, is recognizing that there is a problem and then understanding what that problem is. So, as you've looked at the case study, you know that Karina's in a situation where she's discovered that the company that she works for is illegally dumping toxic chemicals. She finds this out not by the company revealing it to her, but by her discovering it on a switched shift. So the central ethical issue, the main problem that Karina has to solve throughout the context of this particular case study, is what she should do with the information she's learned about the illegal chemical dumping. That seems to be the major problem that Karina's faced with here, and that particular issue will be the focus of the model going forward. We're going to look at that particular problem and then use the steps to resolve that dilemma. Now, it's important to remember that when you're dealing with ethical problems, often those problems come in a constellation or cluster. Moral issues are almost never simple. And so part of this model is also ask you to identify as many ethical nuances as you can in this case. What are the other issues that make up the context here? So you notice that I've gone through and looked at some of the other ethical problems that show up in Karina's dilemma that are separate from and inform the larger issue that she's trying to solve. First, there's the question of fraud on the part of the company. They're misreporting what their dumping practices are to government oversight agencies, so they're lying to get their way. Secondly, the company is coercing its employees into silence, so they're strong-arming their own employees to fall into line and not reveal the dumping, which is also ethically questionable. It also seems to be that the company is intentionally or willfully polluting the environment. Among other things, one might argue, as far as ethical issues are concerned, that the environment has a special protected moral status, and to intentionally violate that constitutes a kind of wrongdoing. Also, the company is exposing the public to risks of which it's unaware. It's one thing for a company to ask us to absorb risks that we might know about. For example, when you hear an advertisement for a new medicine, they'll warn you what the side effects might be so that you can make an informed decision about the risks to your health. But here, this company is exposing the public to risks without their knowledge, and that seems ethically questionable. Another sort of bigger picture ethical problem here is that Karina's company is prioritizing profit, or making money, over public safety. Now, this is a clash of values at kind of a higher level that sort of sets the stage for this entire issue. Is it more important for a company to make profit, or is it more important for a company to honor public safety requirements? It's sort of a bigger picture ethical question. And then lastly, a kind of issue that a lot of people miss, the focus in this case is largely on what Karina should do about the wrongdoing of her company, but her company is not the only one doing wrong in this particular circumstance. For example, they're subcontracting out the disposal of this waste, and that means that they've got subcontractors who are complicit in their wrongdoing. For example, if it's wrong to rob a bank, it's wrong to be a getaway driver. In this case, the subcontractors are sort of the getaway drivers for what's going on in Karina's company. So look at that. There's a lot of ethical richness in this case over and above or beyond just the question of what Karina should do about the chemical dumping. And making a good ethical decision involves trying to tease through or figure out as many of the nuances of the case that you're looking at as you possibly can. Once you've identified the issues to a level of your own satisfaction, move on to the second step, which, as you recall, is research. An informed ethical decision is typically a better decision than an uninformed one. So before Karina acts or goes further in the process, what she ought to do is do a little information gathering. What more could she find out about this particular case to help her come to a better decision? Now, it isn't immediately obvious when you think about her case study to see avenues that she might pursue, but here I've listed 4 possible areas for Karina to research. First, she could herself look up the regulations on waste disposal. She's making assumptions about whether or not this is being done the right way or based on hearsay from other employees of the company. But perhaps if she looked up the regulations on her own, she might have a clearer picture of whether or not her company is or isn't in compliance. Another thing that she might do is find out exactly where the waste is dumped. She thinks that it's being dumped near the reservoir, but that's just a supposition on her part, and she doesn't know exactly where the waste is going. So that might be a crucial thing to find out, namely to the question of whether or not the public is actually being put into risk. Third, she could find out what kind of waste is being dumped. All she saw were barrels that were marked toxic, and that doesn't exactly tell her what's being taken away, whether or not they are in fact containers full of what she thinks is toxic waste, to verify exactly what is being dumped. And then lastly, she could get information about the subcontractors who are working for Karina's company. Perhaps there's something in their business charters or in their way of doing business that might give her some insights on their role in this particular problem. Once Karina's gathered more information, she should move on to the analysis step. Now, as you recall, the analysis section involved 3 distinct phases. The first is to identify options for solving the central ethical issue. The second is to recognize the stakeholders or people who are affected by the way that the issue is resolved. And then the third phase is to put those 2 things back together and talk about the way that each option affects that list of stakeholders. So you'll notice that here on this flipboard, I have a chart that sort of fills this in for you. And I think that's a pretty good way to go as far as organizing your thoughts. And in fact, your instructor may ask you to set this section of the assignment up this way, may or may not, but I think it's a handy way to organize your thought. So along the top, we would list options for the person who's making the decision, in this case, Karina. How should she solve or could she solve this problem? On the side, we would list stakeholders, people who are affected. And then in the boxes where the list or the stakeholder and the option meet, then you'd list the likely outcomes for that option on that person. So along the top, I've got 4 options here. Your instructor may want more than that, but we'll get started with 4. The first option for Karina is to remain silent and not say anything. Just keep doing her job and ignore that anything's happened. The second option that she has is to quit her job and find a new place of employment. It's sort of avoiding the problem, but it is an option for her. The third option, Karina could tell her uncle, the reporter, and anonymously blow the whistle. And then the fourth option is to give the company an ultimatum, to let them know that she knows what's going on and tell the management that she'll report them if they don't stop illegally dumping. So who are the people who are affected? Karina, obviously, the main decision maker, is a primary stakeholder. Remember that she's a single mother of 2 children, so her kids are stakeholders in this. If mom loses her job, then the kids are clearly affected. Karina's coworkers, the managers of the company, the local citizens, and her reporter uncle all have a direct stake in how this situation is resolved. Now, I won't go through filling in every box here, but you guys get kind of an idea of what's going on. If you look over here on the far right, if Karina were to deliver an ultimatum to the company and ask them to stop dumping or else she'll report it, what are the likely outcomes for her? That's what we want to plug into these boxes here. Well, she may have a clear conscience, and she may or may not lose her job in retaliation from the company. But at least in one respect, Karina would be happy about this decision, or it would be good for her in the fact that she feels like she's done something about perceived wrongdoing. But that may or may not result in good outcomes for her. As far as her uncle, let's say, is another stakeholder example here. If Karina gives the company the ultimatum, he stands to lose out on a pretty big story, right? Depending on how the management goes with Karina's ultimatum. If they don't act in compliance with what Karina suggested, or they do, and she doesn't report it to her uncle, then he misses out on the story. So the outcomes for him of the ultimatum are very different from Karina, and it's important that we take the time to think through each option and how it affects each stakeholder. And this chart is a pretty handy way to do that. Once you've completed the analysis section, you move on to the application step of the critical thinking model. Now this one we're not going to delve into too much detail here because there will be subsequent videos in future units that will talk about each of the ethical theories and how their particular principles would apply at this stage of the game. In everyday life, you use the ethical principles that come naturally to you or help you make a good decision, like thou shalt not kill or thou shalt not steal, we ought to report wrongdoing when we see it, we ought not to be complicit in wrongdoing, and so on. But for the purposes of this class, we will ask you to use the ethical principles that you'll learn about throughout this course at this particular phase of the game. So for example, the utility principle from act utilitarianism, or perhaps Kant's categorical imperative of universality, or the difference principle from contractarianism, or some combination of those to help you narrow down the options that you identify in the analysis and sort out the ethical from the unethical options, and you use the principles from our ethical theories to do that here at this step. Now, once you've gone through the work of applying the ethical theories principles, it's time to make a decision. Now, your instructors aren't in the business of telling you what to decide. That you're a free-thinking person with your own points of view and your own decisions, and you'll be working this model to try to come to your own good decision. So at this phase, this is where you will give your particular point of view. Which of the options you identified is the one that you think is ethically best or morally correct? That is, in short, which option from your analysis is the right way for Karina to go in this particular case? Now, it isn't enough just to give your point of view here. You also want to give justification for it. So support your decision with as many good reasons as you can possibly come up with. That way, if someone disagrees with you, they can at least see that you've been reasonable. I often tell my students never believe anything anyone says unless they can give you good reason to believe it. And this is your opportunity here to give someone else good reason for thinking that your point of view is at least well-founded, if not right. So give your best attempt at giving your best possible answer on the question of which decision you think is the ethically best one. Now in this case, I'm going to hypothetically say that Karina should give the management an ultimatum. She should give them the opportunity to fix their wrongdoing before she goes and tells outside sources. So she says, hey, look, manager, fix this illegal dumping or I'm going to talk to my uncle, the reporter, and I want to get this out. Now, why do I think that that's a good answer? Remember what I just said, you have to give good reason for your point of view. Well, first of all, it gives the company a fair chance to self-correct. Right up to this point, she has knowledge that they're doing wrong, but she hasn't yet had the opportunity, they haven't yet had the opportunity to be shown their error and try to fix it on their own, which is typically a pretty good first step when we notice wrongdoing, or if we're trying to educate someone, show them what they're doing wrong and then allow them the opportunity to self-correct. This likely decreases public health risks one way or the other. If one of the concerns here is the fact that Karina is concerned about the toxic waste seeping into the reservoir, one way or the other, whether the company is discovered by Karina's dropping dime on them or whether they self-correct, probably what's going to happen as an outcome is that the public health risk will decrease. Karina, furthermore, satisfies the demands of her conscience and displays moral courage. It takes an awful lot of courage to stand up to someone who you know is doing wrong and challenge them to stop. And that displays a special kind of courage on Karina's part. That's a morally commendable kind of behavior. And it makes her feel better about trying to do the right thing in the face of pressure to not do so. And lastly, doing something is morally preferable to doing nothing. Right? We might say from the perspective of ethics, keeping her head down and doing her job is cowardly if doing something about it is courageous. And so doing nothing is morally worse than displaying moral courage. And quitting her job and finding some other place to work is equally morally cowardly in the sense that she's really not doing anything about the problem. Her children, the community, they're still at risk. She hasn't really done anything about the wider concerns. She's just looking out for herself. So on the basis of those reasons, I would argue Karina should give the management the ultimatum. Now you'll recall, contrary to the way that we typically make decisions, once we've decided something in our process, that's not the end of the story. There are 2 more steps to go. So we want to move on to step number 6, which is the evaluation section. In the evaluation part of our process, we want to be certain that we've come to a well-founded decision, to test to see whether or not we've let our own assumptions get in the way, to show that we've been fair to other points of view or other possibilities. In short, to really consider broadly whether or not we've taken everything into account. As you may recall from an earlier video, one useful way at getting this is to or getting at this is to think about arguments from other points of view that may disagree with what your decision is, and try to take that perspective and then see if you can address it. So I've thought of 2 counter arguments to my decision here, and then I'll give responses to those counter arguments. That's a pretty good skill to get familiar with. Figure out what someone might say in response to your decision and then be able to address it. It shows that you've really thought around the issue carefully. So the first objection might go something like this. Doesn't my decision assume too much benevolence on the company's part? If it has a track record of bad behavior, why should we assume that it will suddenly change? This is a company that's intentionally polluting the environment and taking steps to cover that up. They're illegally using, or they're using subcontractors to distance themselves from their wrongdoing. They look villainous. So why should I assume that if Karina goes to them that they'll do anything about it? And why wouldn't they just retaliate against Karina? Fire her, stifle her, gag her, whatever. Companies sometimes aren't the most nobly upright kinds of organizations, so why should I assume that Karina's is any different? This is essentially the objection. A second objection might go something like this. Other options don't put Karina in harm's way. For example, if she anonymously reports the dumping to her uncle, the reporter, and the word gets out, Karina's essentially off the railroad tracks from any reprisals. At least that's the way it seems. So why shouldn't she just anonymously blow the whistle instead of giving this probably callous and unconcerned company the benefit of the doubt? So how would I respond to those? Those are pretty good objections. So what would I say in response to those to help sort of continuously support my decision? Well, in response to the first, what I might say is, look, I'm not really assuming that this company is benevolent. I'm just giving them a chance, right? Giving them an opportunity to do the right thing. It's built into this particular example that Karina can always blow the whistle later. But there's a principle that we call the principle of last resort, which you may or may not hear about in your class. But the principle of last resort tells us we should start with the least drastic solution first and then move to the most drastic as a matter of escalation. So for example, if a child misbehaves, it's typically best to start by saying, look, kid, you need to modify your behavior, give them a timeout, take away their Xbox before you move to more advanced forms of punishment or more severe forms of punishment. You see the same thing in diplomacy. You start by imposing sanctions against the government before you go to war, right? War should be the last resort. We start with something less drastic first. And that, I would say in response, is what we're doing here. We're starting with the least drastic solution. We'd say, okay, we're going to give you a chance to self-correct. And then if that doesn't work, we escalate things by turning you into outside agencies. So the principle of last resort tells me that I'm not assuming good behavior on the company's part. I'm just respecting this ethical principle. In response to the second one, that anonymously reporting keeps Karina out of harm's way, to say the only way that Karina avoids retaliation entirely is to do nothing. If she quits her job and moves somewhere else, that's a sort of built-in form of retaliation. If she basically drops dime and goes to her uncle, it won't take long to figure out how that story got from the company to Uncle the reporter to the newspaper. And chances are she'd get retaliated on if she took that option anyway. So if the danger of retaliation is there and her moral courage is such that she wants to do something about it, she won't stay out of harm's way no matter what she does if she does anything about it. So notice I've addressed the assumptions or apparent assumptions that my argument makes, and then I've responded on behalf of my position against those objections. So that shows a kind of thinking around the problem that shows that I've really thought this through. And that's the kind of thing we'll be asking you to do here in the evaluation. The last step of the process is to reflect on your use of the decision-making model. It's not so much that you want to think more about the case study that you've just solved, so we could think more about Karina's dilemma. Rather, here you're doing a little bit of self-coaching and thinking about what you might have done to be better at using the process. So for example, I think I might have been more creative in finding options. I only came up with 4, at least in our chart. Maybe I could have come up with 6 or 7. Maybe there were other ways I could have sliced those options out that would have given Karina a little bit more space to work with, at least as far as I conceived her problem. I put this in here because we didn't select any ethical principles, but maybe I'll be more careful in selecting my ethical principles. I really only talked about the principle of last resort, but suppose that I looked at it from the perspective of an act utilitarian, or suppose I did look at it from the perspective of an act-utilitarianism, or act-utilitarian, I could have taken into perspective another ethical theorist point of view. I also might have done more balanced, fair-minded research. Right? These are the kinds of things that you might reflect on. You might say, hey, these are my strengths or weaknesses in the process. These are areas where I might work to improve, to get better at doing this. And like with anything else, the more you do it, the easier it gets. The more practiced you are, the better you are, and that's no different here. But it takes reflection to get to that place. If you don't know what you're doing wrong or you don't know what your strengths are, you have nothing to build on. So that completes our application of the critical thinking model, and that concludes our videos on critical thinking. Good luck with the rest of the course.